In the gleam of Rome's marble and the shimmer of its palaces, there was a shadow world most histories quietly ignore. We praise Roman legions, law, and monumental architecture, yet few accounts pause to tell the stories of those whose labor and bodies were hidden behind that splendor. Among the most silenced were young men pressed into intimate servitude for the empire's wealthy elite. These weren't ordinary household attendants. They were men stripped of agency and forced into roles that exploited their looks and their youth for private amusement. Their lives expose a harsher side of Rome, one that tears away the glossy myth of civilization and reveals exploitation as a pillar of power. Before we dive deeper into these erased lives, quick favor, if uncovering the hidden corners of history is your thing, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. Also, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. It amazes me how these ancient stories connect people across the globe. To understand how this system functioned, we need to see it through Roman eyes. Intimacy, in many elite households, was governed by status and domination rather than modern ideas of mutual consent. Power decided who could love, who could desire, and who would be treated as property. At the bottom of that hierarchy sat men taken from conquered peoples or born into servitude, thrust into positions they never chose. Often prized for their appearance rather than any craft or talent, these men were appraised and traded, much like the other commodities of Rome's economy.
The selection process itself was chilling. Wealthy patrons visited slave markets and private auctions where young men were inspected for bodily traits and lineage. Buyers evaluated skin tone, build, and refinement depending on fashion and personal taste. Greeks for perceived culture, Gauls or northern peoples for rugged features, as if choosing art rather than acknowledging human beings. There was no concern for the terror of standing exposed while strangers discussed your price and future fate. Once purchased, a new reality began. These men entered households where every hour could be claimed by their master's whims. Many were required to be perpetually available, anticipating needs and providing companionship on command. They were expected to present a facade of contentment and compliance, regardless of their inner turmoil. Some masters invested in their concubines' education and appearance, granting fine clothing, lessons, or access to culture. But such privileges were strings attached, not freedom. Comfort and cruelty often lived side by side. Luxury in the presence of the patron, isolation and dispossession in private quarters. The daily lives varied. In Grand Domus, a favored companion might dine beside the household's guests, learn to read and play music, and be paraded as a symbol of status. In less benevolent homes, the role reduced to a brief, humiliating appearance when summoned, followed by long hours of confinement in sparse rooms, stripped of privacy and possession. In every case, personal autonomy was absent. Relationships, friendships, and long-term plans were curtailed by the reality that they belonged to someone else.
What made the situation especially bleak was the legal vacuum surrounding these men. Roman law protected citizens and offered certain rules, even for slaves, but concubines in intimate servitude often stood in a grey zone where their master's interest overrode any formal safeguard. They could not appeal to magistrates without grave risk, and the social structures that might have offered solace, family ties, community support, were intentionally weakened or severed. Expressing pain or resistance could bring punishment rather than rescue. The psychological impact of this life was profound. Imagine living under constant surveillance, forced to perform gratitude and charm, while your dignity is undermined day after day. Many suffered intense shame, identity fragmentation, and a pervasive sense of helplessness. The manipulation wasn't just physical, it was emotional and social, designed to erode self-worth and reinforce dependence on the master's approval. Physical abuse was also a reality. Punishments, neglect, and the casual violence of those who felt entitled to control another human being left long-term scars. Some concubines attempted to escape or to find small rebellions, secret friendships, clandestine letters, or bargaining for better treatment. But these acts carried severe risk. For most, the system allowed little room for meaningful resistance. Yet the picture is complicated. A few found relative stability within this structure. Certain patrons offered protection, education, or paths to manumission. The line between exploitation and a precarious survival strategy could be thin. Even so, these rare outcomes do not erase the broader pattern, a societal mechanism that commodified bodies for prestige and pleasure, with devastating consequences for those trapped inside. In many ways, the story of male concubines in Rome is a mirror of the empire itself. Magnificent in public display, morally compromised behind closed doors. These men's experiences remind us that grandeur often has a hidden cost, and that history's outstanding monuments were built, in part, on the suffering of the powerless. If this subject grabbed you, stick around. We'll explore specific cases next. A famed household where a concubine's fate sparked scandal, and the archaeological traces that help us piece together their lives. Tell me below if you want a deep dive into any particular region or era of Rome. And if you found this episode revealing, share it with someone curious about the darker corners of the past. Masters used calculated methods to crush resistance and create total dependence. Occasionally, a favored companion would receive comforts or fleeting kindness, only to have those privileges snatched away as a form of discipline. That ebb and flow of reward and denial kept victims perpetually on edge, never certain if a smile would earn praise or if a misstep would bring humiliation. Isolation was another deliberate tactic. Many were cut off from other household members, robbed of friendships or any sense of belonging. For young men torn from their homes, this meant the loss of everything that anchored identity: language, rituals, family ties, leaving them adrift and alone. Rivalry became a tool too. In households that kept several companions, owners often encouraged competition for attention and status. Rather than allowing bonds to form, masters stoked jealousy so that loyalty fractured and solidarity vanished. Men who might otherwise have supported one another instead fought for small mercies, knowing that falling out of favor could worsen their lot. This engineered atmosphere of mistrust served the patron by keeping everyone dependent and divided. Even the education offered in some houses worked as a form of social engineering. Lessons in reading, music, or philosophy were not granted purely out of generosity. They were investments to increase a companion's entertainment value. These skills made them more useful at banquets, more amusing in conversation, and ultimately more valuable as trophies. But they did not translate into real autonomy. Learning became another instrument to shape behavior to the master's tastes.
Their bodies were subject to strict regimens. Daily exercise, rigid diets, and intrusive grooming were enforced to maintain a youthful, marketable appearance. In some instances, owners demanded cosmetic procedures or bodily alterations, performed with primitive methods and no anesthesia, leaving those who underwent them physically scarred and traumatized. Clothing and jewelry functioned as a double message, adornment that signaled status for the owner, while reminding the wearer that they were property dressed for display. Travel might look like privilege from the outside, but it was another means of control. Companions moved with their masters from villa to villa or on provincial journeys, always expected to perform, never free to refuse. New cities and social circles only meant new audiences to placate and fresh opportunities for degradation. Even when a companion appeared to live well, the underlying reality was constraint, mobility without choice. Within the household hierarchy, these men occupied a strange, precarious position. They could be resented by other servants for the role they played, and never truly respected by the freeborn, who viewed them as ornaments. For the families left behind, the loss was agonizingly opaque. Parents and siblings often had no reliable information about their sons' fates. In cultures where kin networks sustained life, this enforced separation was devastating and could permanently sever the social bonds that once defined a young man's place in the world. Economic desperation sometimes played a part. In cases of debt bondage, households handed over sons to settle obligations, choosing the bleak calculus of survival over the impossible alternative of watching more family members starve. These decisions were excruciating. Communities carried the moral weight of sacrificing children to preserve the rest. The psychological toll extended to everyone involved. Parents lived with the knowledge of what they had lost, and the young men bore the burden of a choice that was never their own.
Escape was perilous but not unheard of. The few who tried to flee faced enormous dangers: punishment, recapture, or death. The scant records that survive hint at desperate bids for freedom. Secret alliances, covert letters, bribed guards, and risky flights by night. Yet for most, the system offered only narrow pathways: endurance, occasional favors, or the faint hope of a future where status could be bargained into manumission. Even that slim hope often depended on luck or the whims of the powerful. Owners enforced brutal deterrents to keep escape attempts rare and memorable. Failed flights were punished publicly, not simply to inflict pain, but to humiliate and to send a clear message. Run, and everyone will see what happens. That spectacle of discipline reinforced absolute authority. For some who could no longer bear the daily degradation, suicide became a tragic temptation. Yet even that desperate option was often blocked. Owners who had spent fortunes acquiring and maintaining favored companions watched constantly, removed anything that might be used for self-harm, and tightened surveillance to avoid losing their investment.
Religion offered little refuge. Despite a pantheon of gods supposedly linked to justice or protection, institutional worship rarely protected those at the margins. A few sought comfort in foreign cults and secret rites, but spiritual life had to be practiced cautiously, hidden from the very households that controlled every movement and belief. Masters often dictated acceptable rituals, leaving little room for genuine solace or moral refuge. Economic forces kept the system thriving. A lucrative demand for attractive or talented companions created a competitive market. Wealthy patrons bid against one another, traders pushed supply, and prices rose, turning human lives into ledger entries. Entire businesses grew around this commerce, and the incentive to capture and traffic young men escalated with each successful sale. There were even institutions devoted to producing desirable companions, similar in purpose, if not in method, to other professional schools of the age. These training centers emphasized appearance, manner, and performance. The training combined physical conditioning with psychological techniques intended to produce compliant, polished individuals who could fulfill elite expectations. The regimen was designed to break down resistances and rebuild identities that fit the buyer's taste.
How early a man entered this world varied, but many joined while still very young. Growing up inside that system stunted normal development. Friendships, personal ambitions, and the chance to form stable relationships were often denied. The formative years of identity and trust were replaced by instruction in how to please, perform, and survive. A profound developmental cost that lasted long after any change of circumstance. Regional customs made small differences in daily treatment, but they did not change the core fact: the absence of freedom. In some provinces, local practices softened certain abuses. In others, conditions could be harsher still. Across the empire, however, concubinage remained a structure where bodily autonomy and personal agency were routinely subordinated to wealth and status. Aging brought its own cruelty. When companions lost the beauty or novelty that had made them valuable, many found themselves discarded. Some were quietly released, others sold downward into harsher households, and a few were left with nothing: no property, no network, and no real means to rebuild a life. The rare individuals who did manage to gain freedom and reinvent themselves became exceptions, precisely because escape and reintegration were so difficult. Their recovery often required erasing or masking the past and enduring long-term psychological effects. Medical care existed, but it served the owner's interest more than the person's welfare. Physicians were called upon when looks or function needed preserving. Treatments aimed to maintain market value, not to address trauma or long-term health. In short, health services were an investment in property, not compassion for a human being. Taken together, these practices reveal a stark contradiction. Rome publicly celebrated ideals like honor, duty, and civic virtue, yet its elite tolerated, even normalized, a system that commodified human bodies for prestige and pleasure. That gulf between public rhetoric and private practice tells us a lot about power, how easily moral language can coexist with exploitation when social status protects the powerful. In Roman society, the pain endured by concubines rarely registered as a moral issue. They were effectively erased from the ethical ledger.
To survive day to day, many of these men developed highly pragmatic behaviors. They learned to read moods, anticipate demands, and perform the exact persona their owner expected. Those survival skills acted as a kind of camouflage, clever, necessary theater that kept the worst abuses at bay, but also forced these men to deny their own emotions and humanity.
Rome's calendar shaped their lives. During loud public festivals, they could be thrust into the glare of entertainment and spectacle. In quieter seasons, they faced long stretches of anxious waiting, always braced for the next summons. Conversation with peers was dangerous and often forbidden, yet where it was possible, furtive networks formed. A glance, a subtle gesture, a hidden message could mean the difference between safety and punishment. These small, secret interactions were lifelines in an otherwise isolating existence. The wider effect of this system touched Roman culture itself. Treating people as ornamental property helped normalize cruelty across elite circles, making it easier to rationalize other brutal practices, from staged violence in the arena to harsh responses to rebellion. Archaeology gives us faint but telling traces, domestic items that suggest surveillance, personal tokens that hint at private lives, and material culture that points to the everyday realities of those who served behind closed doors. Texts of the era rarely speak plainly. Authors often allude to such relationships with euphemism or silence. Read between those lines, though, and a harsher story emerges, one of dispossession and constrained existence. Being transferred from one household to another was among the most destabilizing events a companion could face. Each sale meant a fresh set of rules, a new master's temperament to decipher, and the emotional labor of remaking oneself to fit unfamiliar expectations. Some owners treated their companions as transient pleasures to be traded or discarded. Others became attached in patterns that, while less brutal, still left the companion entirely dependent. In every case, the person's fate was decided by another's whim. Mobility was presented as a perk for a few, but in reality it was often yet another tool of control. When masters moved between city residences and rural villas, companions were carried along, uprooted repeatedly, denied the chance to plant roots or develop meaningful ties to place. Constant relocation demanded adaptability, but also prevented stability, leaving lives lived in transit rather than community. Cultural training added another layer of contradiction. These men were tutored in music, verse, and manners. Steeped in the very arts they were denied the right to pursue on their own terms. They became vessels of refined taste, expected to perform and reflect elite sensibilities while being shut out from genuine creative authorship. The refinement of their deportment only underscored their lack of agency. Physical regimens were similarly coercive. Exercise programs, strict diets, and relentless grooming were enforced to preserve a marketable look. In extreme cases, practices intended to alter or enhance appearance were carried out with crude methods that risked health and caused pain. What might look like pampering from the outside was often a regimen of bodily control meant to preserve commercial value. Medical attention, when it occurred, served a narrow purpose: to maintain fitness and attractiveness for the owner's benefit. Physicians were employed to heal wounds or preserve appearance, not to treat trauma or foster long-term well-being. In short, healthcare functioned as a maintenance service for property rather than an act of care for a person. Taken together, these dynamics paint a vivid picture, a system that rewarded spectacle and status at the expense of human dignity. The people who performed in that system developed complex, often tragic strategies to endure. Their stories, fragmentary, suppressed, and sometimes only hinted at, reveal how deeply power can warp social life and how the cost of grandeur is too often paid by those whose voices history has mostly buried. Young men conscripted into intimate service had no say over the demands placed on their bodies. Exercise routines, strict diets, and even invasive alterations could be forced upon them, regardless of pain or long-term harm. Public festivals and private banquets only amplified this pressure. What looked like pageantry to guests often meant staged performances and opportunities for degradation for those forced to appear. The bright lights of celebration were frequently another arena for humiliation rather than relief. Forming honest relationships was almost impossible. Even when living amid comfort, these companions existed at the mercy of a patron's favor.
a fragile status that made true friendship or romance risky and rare. Meanwhile, the supply networks that fed Rome's demand reached deep across the Mediterranean. Kidnapping, wartime capture, and debt bondage all fed the trade in human lives, ravaging families and communities as the market sought ever more desirable recruits. Training academies and handlers drilled newcomers not just in skills, but in submission. Conditioning techniques were applied to erode resistance and create dependence. Psychological manipulation was as much a part of the system as physical control. Clothing, jewelry, and elaborate grooming signaled wealth for the owner, while serving as constant visual reminders of the wearer's lack of agency. Cosmetic procedures and other interventions, crude, painful, and often dangerous, were performed to match a buyer's tastes, with little concern for consent or well-being. The developmental toll was profound. Growing up or spending formative years in this environment warped ideas of consent, autonomy, and healthy intimacy. Social isolation, often engineered by owners, deprived many of the networks and skills needed to survive independently or to mount an effective escape. Economically, people were reduced to fluctuating price tags. Age, looks, talent, and origin dictated market value, making it easier for owners and traders to rationalize treating lives as inventory. This normalization of commodification had wide cultural effects. When elite society accepts the routine objectification and abuse of vulnerable people, it lowers the bar for other cruelties. Punitive spectacles, brutal suppression of dissent, and institutionalized violence become easier to justify. Still, fragments of resistance appear in the record. Small, dangerous acts of defiance, attempts to run, or secret alliances formed in the shadows. These glimpses show that, even under crushing systems, individuals sometimes pushed back in ways that affirmed their humanity. Religious and philosophical debate offered little comfort. Public debates about virtue or justice rarely extended protections to those without standing. The contradiction is stark. A civilization capable of eloquent moral reflection could simultaneously tolerate practices that stripped people of dignity. That contradiction is part of the story, and it forces us to reckon with how grandeur and brutality coexisted in Rome's social world. The yearly rhythms of Roman life set a cruel timetable for those forced into intimate service. Certain festivals and social seasons meant predictable spikes in demand, more performances, more exposure, more opportunities for humiliation, so even the quiet months were shadowed by the looming expectation of spectacle. That constant anticipation became a form of slow violence, a life lived perpetually braced for the next ordeal. The damage extended far beyond individual households. Removing young men from villages and families tore apart social networks and left communities weakened. The supply chains that fed Rome's appetite, raids, wartime captures, and the sale of the indebted, created waves of loss that reshaped entire regions. What looked like a single transaction on a ledger actually unraveled lives and traditions back home. Training systems formalized the process. Young recruits were conditioned through routines designed to erode defiance and produce pliant companions. Over time, these methods were refined into an efficient if brutal regime. Physical drills, performance coaching, and psychological pressures combined to manufacture compliant behavior. The result was an industry that profited from broken wills. Legally, these men were invisible. The Roman apparatus regarded them largely as possessions, denied the protections a citizen might expect. That legal silence made abuse routine and impunity ordinary. There was no reliable avenue for redress, and owners operated with near complete authority. When the law treats people as property, cruelty becomes bureaucratic and normalized. Economics underpinned the cruelty. As long as handsome companions commanded good prices, traders and patrons had incentive to maintain the market. Age, looks, skills, and origin fluctuated the value placed on a person, turning human life into a commodity whose worth could be calculated and traded. That calculus made disposability feel like sound business practice to the powerful. The bodily and mental toll was devastating. Systematic conditioning stripped many of basic autonomy and damaged the psychological scaffolding that forms healthy adults. Even if freedom later came, the wounds ran deep. Trust, consent, and the capacity for ordinary relationships were often impaired for life. Recovery was possible but rare. The social and emotional rebuilding required was enormous.
Still, human resilience appeared in tiny, tenacious acts. Secret friendships, whispered warnings, clandestine letters, and small rebellions punctuated the record. These refusals, however modest, are proof that people resisted being wholly erased. Even under systems designed to crush agency, fragments of dignity endured. Studying these lives forces difficult comparisons with our own era. The mechanics of domination, economic incentives, legal gaps, cultural acceptance, are patterns that can recur in other shapes and times. Recognizing them in the past helps us spot and contest similar dynamics today. The silence around these men has been long and deep, but naming their experiences matters. Remembering them is not voyeurism, it is an ethical act. It means acknowledging that the grandeur of an empire often had a hidden human cost, and that the luxury of some was paid for with the freedom of others. In the end, the history of male concubinage in Rome is a lesson about power, how public virtue can coexist with private vice, and how institutions can shield brutality behind polished rituals. Their lives compel us to look beyond marble facades and ask whose suffering made the splendor possible, and to insist that future societies refuse to repeat the same mistakes. And if you believe stories like these deserve to be heard, not buried, take a moment to support this work. Hit subscribe, share this video with someone who loves history, and help bring forgotten voices back into the light. Every click keeps these hidden truths alive.